USS Sampson crossed the Bab-el-Mandeb on the 28th of July 2026. She was operating alone, no escort, no carrier overhead, no cruiser on her wing. The strait is 18 miles wide at its narrowest point. Houthi shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles can reach 40 miles. The math was not in her favor, and the Navy sent her anyway. Retention checkpoint 000. Hooktianity. Here is what made that transit worth studying. Open source analysis of Sampson's engagement log going back to May suggests she entered the strait carrying somewhere between 22 and 28% of her vertical launch system capacity in active surface-to-air ordnance. Her SM-2 cells, her SM-6 cells, her ESSM quad packs, months of rotational intercept duty against Houthi one-way attack drones and ballistic missile salvos had burned through her magazine at a pace the public record lets you approximate if you count the intercepts and work backward from the known loadout of a flight Arleigh Burke. She was not empty, but she was close, and Fifth Fleet routed her through the strait anyway, in daylight, in a corridor every adversary with a radar can monitor. The question the transit raises is not whether Sampson could defend herself. The question is why the United States Navy would deliberately move a partially expended destroyer through one of the most watched choke points on Earth, in a configuration that any Iranian IRGC analyst or Houthi targeting cell could read. And the answer is not about USS Sampson at all. It is about every ship that comes after her. Retention 1230 resolution Ts. Feel. This is a video about magazine depth, about what the United States can afford to signal, and why that signal costs exactly as much as it appears to cost, and not $1 more. About the logistics chain that makes a nearly empty destroyer a more powerful strategic instrument than a full one, under specific conditions, in a specific theater. And about what Iran and the Houthis saw when they tracked Sampson through that 18-mile corridor, and what the tracking itself was supposed to tell them. If you want the strategy behind the headline instead of the headline, subscribe to Blue Water. This channel exists for exactly this kind of transit. The ones that look like a mistake from the outside and read like a message once you see the full board. Let us start with the choke point itself. The Bab-el-Mandeb connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. It is the maritime gateway between the Indian Ocean and the Suez Canal. Roughly 12% of global trade moves through it annually. In terms of oil transit, approximately 6 million barrels per day moved through the strait before the Houthi campaign began degrading commercial shipping confidence. More relevant to this analysis, it is the corridor through which every ship servicing the Eastern Mediterranean, the European landmass, and the Western supply chain from Asia must transit if it is not rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 2 to 3 weeks of steaming time, and roughly $1 million in additional fuel and charter costs per voyage. The strait has 2 navigable channels. The larger, to the west, runs roughly 16 miles wide between the Yemeni coast and the Djiboutian shore. The smaller eastern channel, between Yemen and the island of Perim, is only about 2 miles wide and is not used by major commercial vessels. The geometry means that Houthi targeting assets on the western Yemeni coast have a relatively compact engagement window for any ship in the primary channel. Shore-based anti-ship missiles do not need to search a wide ocean. They aim at a corridor.
When the Houthis began their campaign against commercial and naval shipping in late 2023, they understood the choke point's arithmetic better than most of the Western analysts covering the story. You do not need to sink ships. You need to make the transit expensive enough that the calculation shifts. Insurance rates rise, carriers reroute, the strait becomes a tax on the system even if no hull ever goes down.
The U.S. Navy's response was Operation Prosperity Guardian and the establishment of Task Force 153, a multinational escort and interdiction force operating under Fifth Fleet authority. The centerpiece of the naval component was the rotational presence of Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers cycling through the southern Red Sea, intercepting drone salvos, engaging ballistic missiles on descending trajectories, and absorbing the attritional cost of the Houthi campaign in ordnance rather than in hulls or in blood. By the spring of 2026, that attritional math had become the dominant logistics story in the theater. The Houthis were firing relatively cheap munitions. Shahed-derived one-way attack drones cost somewhere in the range of $20,000 per airframe. The Iranian-supplied anti-ship ballistic missiles are more expensive, but they are drawing from an Iranian stockpile that Tehran has invested years in building precisely because the weapons are cheap enough to use freely. The interceptors are not. An SM-2 Block 2IB costs somewhere between $2 and $4 million per round, depending on the contract variant. An SM-6 runs roughly $4 million at current acquisition prices. ESSM runs approximately $1.2 million per missile. When a destroyer launches 8 interceptors in a single engagement cycle against a mixed swarm, the cost asymmetry is not subtle. Retention checkpoint 400 stakes bend 20. The strangest part of the Red Sea rotation is not the cost. Strategists in Washington and Newport have understood the cost asymmetry since the campaign began. The strangest part is the magazine. A Burke-class flight YIA destroyer carries 96 vertical launch cells. In a full combat load configured for air defense, she might carry 42 SM-2 rounds, 6 SM-6 rounds, and 32 ESSM missiles stacked 4-to-A cell in 8 quad-pack configurations, along with Tomahawk inventory and anti-submarine ordnance filling the remaining cells. That is the theoretical baseline. The actual loadout on any given deployment is a classified document, but the number of rounds expended in engagements is over time reconstructible from open sources. Naval aviation blogs, DVIS footage timestamps, Fifth Fleet press releases that confirm engagements without specifying intercept counts, and the pattern of resupply ship movements tracked by commercial satellite imagery. By July 2026, the open-source community had reached a rough consensus. USS Sampson, having completed multiple high-tempo engagement windows between May and late July, was running low. Estimates circulating publicly placed her surface-to-air inventory somewhere between 22 and 30% of capacity. The Navy confirmed nothing. They denied nothing. And when Fifth Fleet routed Sampson through the Bab-el-Mandeb on July 28, the ship moved on the commercial AIS track that any monitoring system could follow. No escort visible on the open ocean horizon. No announcement. Her deck configuration readable to any analyst watching the strait. They sent her through, and they let the world do the math. What do you think was routing a partially expended destroyer through a contested chokepoint, a calculated signal, or was it a logistics necessity the Navy dressed up as strategy after the fact? That question has a real answer, and the answer is in the resupply timeline. The Military Sealift Command announced in late July 2026 an expansion of commercial dry cargo and ammunition ship contracting in the Fifth Fleet area of operations. The announcement was framed in acquisition language, the way Pentagon logistics announcements always are, but the operational content was clear to anyone reading it against the backdrop of the Red Sea campaign. MST was increasing its capacity to move ordnance from pre-positioned stockpiles to forward-deployed combatants without routing through Bahrain's naval support activity, which had become a visible and therefore vulnerable logistics node. The expansion included contracting for additional T-8-class dry cargo ships, the Lewis and Clark-class vessels that function as the Navy's mobile magazines, and accelerating the rotation schedule for USNS Supply-class fast combat support ships operating in the region. The Diego Garcia connection is the part of this story that most coverage missed entirely. Diego Garcia sits in the Indian Ocean, roughly 1,800 miles southeast of the Bab-el-Mandeb and 3,800 miles from the Strait of Hormuz. It hosts a pre-positioning squadron, warehouses holding munitions, aviation fuel and equipment for a major combat force, and a deepwater anchorage capable of handling multiple large combatants simultaneously. The island's logistics function in any Middle East or Indian Ocean contingency is straightforward. It is the magazine that sits behind the forward edge, close enough to move material forward within days, far enough from the threat envelope that it can function without constant defensive coverage. In the weeks surrounding Sampson's transit, commercial satellite imagery analysts documented an uptick in T-8 activity at Diego Garcia. Ships that had been on station there were moving north. The timing aligned with the MSC announcement, and it aligned with the transit of a Burke-class destroyer through the Bab-el-Mandeb at reduced magazine state. The calculus the Navy was running was not complicated. Sampson fires her remaining interceptors if the strait crossing requires it. She reaches Bahrain or Rota or wherever she is headed for reload. The next destroyer in the rotation, already replenished from the Diego Garcia forward movement, takes her position. The gap in coverage, if there is one at all, is measured in hours. What the Navy was demonstrating to every surveillance asset watching that strait was not vulnerability, it was depth. The message, we can afford this. Retention, checkpoint. 50% mid-roll hook, maybe half. Now look at that transit from the Houthi targeting cell's perspective, because that is where the signal lands. The Houthis, and through them the IRGC advisors who provide the operational backbone of their missile and drone program, are not unsophisticated actors. They understand magazine depth and principle. What they do not always have is precise intelligence on how deep the American magazine actually runs at any given moment. Every engagement they watch is data. Every intercept Sampson fired in May and June was a round they could count. By July, they had a working estimate of her remaining capacity. That estimate told them this ship is near the bottom of her surface-to-air inventory. Here is the take that will probably generate some pushback. The Houthis made a rational choice not to engage Sampson during the July 28 transit, and that choice was not because they were intimidated by a half-empty destroyer. It was because they had done the arithmetic on what comes next. They knew, or had to assume, that the United States had another fully loaded destroyer 400 miles behind Sampson in the queue. They knew that any strike on Sampson, successful or not, would produce an American response calibrated not against a single nearly depleted hull, but against a strategic interest. And the IRGC advisors who have been managing Iranian proxy operations for decades understand the difference between a tactical opportunity and a strategic provocation. Unpopular read: the empty cells were not a liability the Navy was managing. They were the instrument. The Navy was using the visible depletion of one ship's magazine to communicate the depth of the fleet's magazine behind it. The signal: we burned through this much ordnance and we are still sending ships. Now calculate what that means for what comes after. This kind of strategic communication through logistics visibility is not new in American naval history. In the Cold War, the U.S. Navy occasionally made its submarine movements more visible than operational security alone would require, precisely to communicate capability and commitment to the Soviet Navy. The visible presence was the deterrent. The geometry of the signal was the message. What the open source era has added is an analysis layer. Every think tank, every OSINT community, every Iranian intelligence analyst with a Twitter account and access to commercial satellite imagery can now do the math that used to require actual espionage, which means the Navy can use that analysis layer as a transmission medium. A concrete detail that has stayed with me in looking at this transit. The AIS tracks showed Sampson maintaining a standard transit speed through the strait, not the high-speed dash a ship in a genuinely precarious position would use to minimize its exposure window. She moved through at a pace that communicated exactly what the transit was: a routine operation with acceptable risk tolerance, not an emergency extraction. The Souda Bay connection adds another layer. The U.S. Navy maintained significant ordnance pre-positioning at Naval Support Activity Souda Bay in Crete, roughly 2,500 miles from the Bab-el-Mandeb, via the Suez Canal. Souda Bay has functioned as the Western logistics anchor for Fifth Fleet operations during the Red Sea campaign, providing the ability to flow ordnance eastward through the canal, while Diego Garcia provides the southern approach. The combination of these two nodes creates a logistics geometry that effectively gives the Navy two independent resupply vectors for its Red Sea forces, neither of which can be interdicted without a major escalation against NATO infrastructure or a sovereign U.S. facility. Most people assume that a Navy operating forward at high tempo against a sustained threat is operating at the ragged edge of its logistics capacity. The Sampson transit was designed, in part, to correct that assumption. The evidence that the correction worked is largely the absence of an engagement. The Houthis did not fire, which means either they assessed Sampson as too hard a target despite her depleted state, which seems unlikely given their operational tempo in the preceding months, or they concluded that the cost-benefit calculation on attacking a U.S. Navy combatant, even a partially expended one, did not favor them given what they assessed about the fleet capacity behind it. On screen, a destroyer moves through open water on a commercial AIS track, no escort, no announcement, visible to any monitoring system watching the strait. That image, broadcast to every intelligence service with a satellite feed, is the message the transit was designed to send. Retention checkpoint.
Our sixth position is running to volley loud.
But the signal was not only for the Houthis. Walk the map a few degrees north and consider who else was watching. Iran's naval doctrine has been built around the concept of asymmetric attrition. Use cheap weapons to impose expensive responses, degrade American forward presence over time, and create the conditions where the cost of maintaining a Fifth Fleet rotation in the Gulf and the Red Sea exceeds the political will to sustain it. The Houthi campaign was, from Tehran's perspective, a field test of this doctrine at scale. It was consuming American SM-2 and SM-6 inventory at a meaningful rate. It was creating political friction around the cost asymmetry. And it was doing so at relatively low cost to Iran directly, since the Houthis bear the operational risk. What the Sampson transit demonstrated to Tehran was the failure mode of the attrition hypothesis. The hypothesis requires that American magazine depth be finite in a way that matters within the operational time frame. What the transit showed is that the Navy has sufficient logistics depth to rotate a partially depleted destroyer through the most watched choke point in the theater as a deliberate signal rather than an emergency maneuver. That is not the behavior of a force approaching logistical limits. That is the behavior of a force with enough magazine depth to use visible depletion as a communication tool. Consider the pure fleet arithmetic. The U.S. Navy operates 11 carrier strike groups, each built around a carrier with its own organic air wing and a screen of Arleigh Burke destroyers. The Arleigh Burke class, across its Flight Mine 2 and IIA variants, numbers roughly 70 hulls in commission or active reserve. The Flight IIA variant, which includes Sampson, carries the same 96-cell VLS configuration optimized for the air defense mission. 70 destroyers, even accounting for maintenance cycles, training commitments, and the Pacific pivot that has pulled significant DDG capacity toward Andopacom, represents a magazine inventory that cannot be meaningfully depleted by the current Houthi operational tempo. The Houthis have launched, by various estimates, over 400 drone and missile attacks since late 2023. The intercept rate achieved by U.S. and coalition forces has been high. Somewhere between 70 and 85% of threats assessed as requiring engagement have been engaged successfully. That is a substantial expenditure of interceptor missiles. It is also, when measured against the total VLS capacity of the Arleigh Burke fleet, a relatively small fraction of available inventory. The attrition model does not work at this scale, because the defender's magazine is orders of magnitude deeper than the attacker's targeting cycle can deplete. Here is what this tells us about the broader strategic moment. The Red Sea campaign has been framed in much of the public commentary as an American vulnerability, a picture of expensive interceptors being fired at cheap drones, a cost asymmetry that favors the attacker. That framing is accurate at the tactical unit level and completely wrong at the fleet level. At the fleet level, the U.S. Navy has more magazine capacity than the Houthi campaign can consume before Iran would face other consequences. What the Sampson transit did was make that arithmetic visible in a single concrete image, a partially depleted ship moving through the most contested strait in the theater at normal transit speed, without escort. The message: this is what we look like when we have used most of one ship's missiles. We have 69 more ships. Will that calculus hold as the conflict extends into 2027 and beyond? Comment your read below. What strikes me about the Red Sea campaign, looking at it from mid-2026, is how thoroughly it has inverted the conventional narrative around cost asymmetry and asymmetric conflict. The academic literature on insurgent and proxy warfare for the past 2 decades has emphasized the attacker's advantage in cost asymmetry, cheap weapons imposing expensive responses, attrition of the defender's will and resources over time. The Houthi campaign tested that model against a defender with logistics depth that the model had not fully priced in. The result is not a victory for the United States, because the structural problem on the offensive side remains unsolved. But it is a falsification of the hypothesis that cost asymmetry alone is a decisive strategic tool against a logistics-deep opponent. That lesson has implications well beyond Yemen. Retention checkpoint. Microphenomenal of Rufa, 21 minor the personal pride is in blood rough past first braiding, and this is the part of the basing picture that tends to get underweighted in coverage focused on the Indo-Pacific. Naval Station Rota in southwestern Spain is the forward base for the U.S. Navy's Aegis Ashore ballistic missile defense capability in Europe, and it hosts a permanent rotation of 4 Arleigh Burke destroyers assigned to ballistic missile defense operations under 6th Fleet Command. These ships are not part of the Red Sea rotation. They are committed to the European B&D mission, covering ballistic missile threats from Iran against NATO European territory. But their presence at Rota represents additional VLS capacity within steaming range of the Bab-el-Mandeb, accessible via the Strait of Gibraltar and the transit around the Iberian Peninsula. The geometry of the American basing structure creates what strategists call interior lines of logistics, multiple stockpile nodes at different points around a theater, each capable of supporting forward operations, none dependent on a single corridor. Diego Garcia from the south, Souda Bay from the northwest via Suez, Rota from the far northwest via Gibraltar and the Atlantic. Bahrain as the forward operating base in the Gulf itself. The Houthi campaign cannot interdict all of these simultaneously. Iran cannot threaten all of them simultaneously without actions that would constitute attacks on NATO members or major escalations against established American facilities in ways that would invite responses entirely outside the Yemeni theater. The distances carry their own strategic logic. From Rota to the Bab-el-Mandeb is roughly 7,400 miles, a carrier pier departure, 2 weeks of ship wake at sea, and an arrival at the chokepoint. Through Suez from Souda Bay cuts that to 2,500 miles, 5 to 7 days. From Diego Garcia north through the Arabian Sea is 1,800 miles, 3 to 4 days. A resupply hull does not need to be pre-positioned at the strait to close that distance within a short response window. The math of basing and transit time is what makes the Sampson signal credible. Without those hulls already at sea, an empty destroyer is simply an empty destroyer. With them, the vacant cells visible on her deck become the surface expression of a logistics chain stretched across the Pacific Ocean. We should say what this analysis reveals about the institutional design of the forward presence model, because it is not widely appreciated. The pre-positioning strategy that places ordnance at Diego Garcia, at Souda Bay, at Guam, at the various EK sites in the Philippines, and at the European BMD bases, is not primarily designed for the wars those bases are geographically associated with. It is designed to make the total system resilient to any single theater's consumption rate. A high-tempo engagement cycle in the Red Sea draws down inventory at one node while other nodes remain intact. The system's total magazine depth is the relevant number, not any individual ships or bases' remaining capacity. This is the detail of the Sampson transit that most commentary missed. The Navy did not send a partially depleted destroyer through the Bab-el-Mandeb because they had to. They sent one through because they could, and because the act of sending one through at reduced magazine state was worth more as a strategic communication than keeping her in reserve at a comfortable inventory level would have been. The calculation is not about Sampson's readiness. It is about what the transit communicates about the fleet's readiness. One detail in the open-source record that cuts against the clean narrative, the MSC commercial tanker expansion announced in late July, was not universally praised within the naval logistics community. Several analysts noted that the expansion relies on commercial shipping companies operating under wartime charter arrangements, and that the resilience of commercial flag logistics in a high-threat environment has not been tested at scale since the Gulf War tanker escort operations of the 1980s. The question of whether commercial T-8 equivalents can operate reliably in an environment where Iranian-supplied anti-ship missiles are in play is not fully answered. The Sampson transit communicated depth. It did not resolve the question of whether that depth can be moved forward quickly enough under contested conditions. That unresolved variable is where the honest assessment lands. The naval shipyard piers show a logistics architecture that is resilient against the current threat. Supply vessels moving, aircraft carrier deck operations continuing, freedom of navigation patrols maintained. Whether that architecture holds if Iran moves from proxy support to direct strikes on the resupply chain is a different question, and it is the question the Sampson transit, for all the strategic weight carried in those empty cells visible on her deck, does not answer. Retention. Checkpoint. Does that 60s payoff coin? Let us close with the full loop. The transit of USS Sampson through the Bab-el-Mandeb on July 28, 2026, was not a warfighting act. A ship at 25% of her surface-to-air capacity is not optimally positioned for sustained combat in a threat-dense environment. The Navy knows this. The Houthis know this. The IRGC advisors monitoring the strait know this. Everyone who matters in the theater knows this. And the Navy sent her through anyway at normal speed on a visible track without escort in full view of every sensor pointed at that 18-mile corridor. The transit was a message written in fleet arithmetic. We burned through 75% of one ship's missiles defending this strait, and our response is to send that ship through it again on the way home. Not because we have to, because the next ship is already loaded and it is 400 miles behind her, because Diego Garcia has ordnance staged and moving, because MSC has expanded its commercial charter capacity to move that ordnance forward, because Souda Bay and Rota represent logistics nodes that no Houthi anti-ship missile can reach, because the total magazine depth of the Arleigh Burke fleet is a number that the Houthi operational tempo cannot meaningfully reduce within any politically relevant timeframe. Iran looked at that transit and ran the calculation. The calculation did not favor engagement. The strait stayed quiet. One thing remains unresolved. The Houthis have not been rolled back. Their land-based anti-ship cruise missile capability has not been eliminated. The terrain of western Yemen that shelters their launch infrastructure is hostile to the kind of sustained land attack campaign that would be required to structurally degrade their capability rather than simply intercept their weapons in flight. Every SM-6 that Sampson fired was a correct tactical decision. It was also a round that did not destroy a launcher. The launch capacity on the Yemeni coast that prompted those intercepts is still there. The resupply from Iran that keeps those launchers loaded is still flowing. The Sampson transit communicated depth on the defensive side of the equation.
It did not resolve the offensive side. Drop a comment. Is interceptor depth a durable answer to a land-based anti-ship threat that cannot be structurally degraded? Or is the United States running an expensive treadmill? We read every comment.
A radar scope can track every surface contact across the carrier defense screen, but the cells behind those launchers do not reload themselves between engagement windows. The expansion of MSC commercial charter capacity, additional hulls logged at naval shipyard piers, supply chains moving across open ocean, signals that logistics planners know the consumption rate is real. The ship wake of each resupply vessel crossing the Pacific represents time the magazine buys, time the adversary is calculating, time the Sampson transit was designed not to resolve. USS Sampson crossed the Bab-el-Mandeb. She crossed it nearly empty. She crossed it because the fleet behind her was not. That is the whole message. And the message was never about one destroyer. If this analysis gave you a frame the headlines did not, subscribe to Blue Water. The next video maps the logistics geometry of the Pacific, and the numbers there are considerably larger.